Hello YouTube. Today I want to talk about Hanafi history in regards to theology. And I want to talk about the early Hanafis and what theological positions they held. It's made very complicated because early Hanafis held a lot of different and very diverse theological positions. So scholarship at this point is still very unclear as to the theological proclivities of early Hanafis. There is still some evidence that perhaps they were mostly Murji'i and Mu'tazili. So there was some early Murji'a who reserved judgment upon the committer of a major sin that were characterized as changing the Sunnah and were polemically called the Jews of this community, of the Muslim community, whose enmity towards us is more severe than that of Christians and the Jews. So some very heavy and crazy polemics going on there. The Murji'a explicitly, because of their theological views, were prepared to accept temporal rulers even when their behavior was sinful in some respects. The implication was that riots, rebellions, and uprisings against existing rulers were neither necessary nor desirable. Thus, the Murji'ite reaction to the Abbasid rebellion was extremely negative. However, they eventually started working for their Abbasids, reserving judgment about them. They had the reputation of being sellouts, who maintain whatever government seems politique at the time. Many detractors from Abu Hanifa often labeled him as a Murji'i. It is quite well known that the Mu'tazila were held in great esteem before the Mihna, which lasted from 833 Gregorian to 848, an inquisition on the createdness of the Quran, but were subsequently marginalized after the Mihna. The 9th century had Muslims in an intense theological persecution as the Mu'tazila were supported by the Abbasids and torturing those who repudiated the createdness of the Quran. The biggest detractors of the Mu'tazila and Murji'a, i.e. the Mutakallimun, were the Ahl al-Hadith, i.e. the Muhaddithun. The Caliph saw the Ahl al-Hadith as a nefarious force that mobilized the masses, secured for themselves religious authority and integrity despite being sunk in ignorance. From 815 to 912, the majority of judges appointed by the Abbasids were Hanafis, which could mean a plethora of things. Firstly, they could have been mostly Murji'a. They're Murji'a simply pandering to the Mihna and the post-Mihna Abbasids, telling them whatever was politique, reserving judgment. Secondly, they could have been mostly Mu'tazila during the Mihna and subsequently were converted to Ahl Sunnah afterwards. And the term Ahl Sunnah came to denote the Ahl al-Hadith's theological views. So this term Ahl Sunnah and later on Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah was synonymous with the Ahl al-Hadith's creed, with their theological positions, which later morphed into the Athari creed as we know it today, and also kind of started to include the Ash'ari Mutakallimun and the the Maturidi Mutakallimun. So you had, these three things kind of morphed into Sunnism as we know it now. And thirdly, it could have been the case that Hanafis could have been so theologically diverse as to withstand the Mihna nearly unscathed. They had people who were Mu'tazila, they had people who were Murji'i, they had people who were Ahl Sunnah, and whatever else in between, whatever else out there. And it's important to note that the acceptance of the createdness of the Quran was only accepted by Hanafis and no other legal doctrine except rarely. So all the people who were saying the Quran was created happened to be Hanafi. They were Mu'tazili Hanafis or something like that. And it was almost never did you see somebody who wasn't Hanafi saying the Quran is created. So because of that, Hanafi jurisprudence, which is separate from theology abstractly in the minds of those people, it became associated with Mu'tazilism, and it became associated with the Murji'ite movement and other types of things. So it had this social kind of meaning that goes beyond just the jurisprudence. That being said, there were Hanafis who sided with the Ahl al-Hadith, theologically as well. We know the famous Imam al-Tahawi, who wrote later on, who expounded the creed of the Ahl al-Hadith, addressing other Hanafis in his introduction. And it is said by some that Abu Yusuf, the famous student of Abu Hanifa and top judge for the Abbasids, was also a follower of the Ahl al-Hadith creed or theology. Tsafrir also notes that it should be remembered that even if the majority of those advocating the Quran's createdness were Hanafis, the majority of Hanafis did not necessarily advocate this idea. Regardless, it was a Hanafi, Bishr bin Ghiyath al-Marisi, who died in 833, who convinced Caliph al-Ma'mun of the Quran's createdness. So there was a man, his name's Bishr al-Marisi. He was a famous Mu'tazili. You can still find his writings today and preserved in various later writings, and some have gathered them and made books and written done some research here on Bishr al-Marisi. And so he convinced the Caliph that the Quran was created. And then it was another Hanafi judge by the name of Ibn Abi Duwad, among other Hanafis, who imposed the mihna, who actually put the mihna into practice, thus putting the Hanafis in the polemic crosshairs of the Ahl al-Hadith. Most sources also place Abu Hanifa himself as advocating for the createdness of the Quran, while at the same time placing him as a Murji'i. Abu Yusuf, according to most sources, was in agreement with the Ahl al-Hadith regarding the Quran neither being created or uncreated, which was called waqfism or waqifism. Okay? Whereas Muhammad al-Shaybani likely advocated the createdness of the Quran. With all of these three figures I just mentioned, it's speculation. We don't really know. Many sources are highly polemical in nature, and the truth of the matter is a little bit hard to tease out. And there is an extant letter from Abu Hanifa written to the Imam of the Ahl Ra'i in Basra, Uthman al-Batti, which I will get to later in this video. We also know of Fiqh al-Akbar, that is a theological writing from Abu Hanifa. We have some other things from Abu Hanifa that indicate what his position might have been, but there is some debate about these sources. So Bishr bin Ghiyath al-Marisi was ironically a student of Abu Yusuf, and Abu Yusuf threatened to whip him on account of his theological views. In summation, the mihna caused an epistemic shift theologically, where waqifism, the theological position of the Ahl al-Hadith, emerged as the dominant government-sanctioned theology. This had little effect, however, on the number of Hanafis granted judgeships in the Abbasid dynasty. but certainly all government-sanctioned judges were now Waqfists, bringing the Hanafis and the Ahl al-Hadith together theologically. Likely, before and certainly during the Mihna, Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'i polemics were heightened due to theological matters. Therefore, it is hard to decipher if the Ahl al-Hadith legal polemics against the Ahl al-Ra'i did not actually have tacit theological undertones. Just one more thing that we have to possibly consider when reading these polemical source materials between the Ahl al-Hadith and the Ahl al-Ra'i. And I just want to give you here some books for further reading. So for anyone who wants to read in English about this basic history here, I would recommend that you look at the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology and the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology. Obviously, the Cambridge one is smaller. It's more of an introduction. The Oxford one is going to be more in-depth. It's going to be more serious. You would need to know everything in this book in order to really, truly understand this book. And then you can also look at the Creed of Imam al-Taḥāwī. You can look at al-Fiqh al-Akbar. This is a bilingual edition of Imam Taḥāwī's al-Aqīdah Taḥāwīyah, bilingual version of al-Fiqh al-Akbar. You also have this one, Early Shi'i Thought, by Lalani here. And it's important to note that many of the proto-Shia, they were part of the Ahl al-Hadith movement. Many of them were also Shafi'i later on, sometimes in the Hanbali. And early on, many Shi'i in the Shia in this period, they were what they were called as the Akhbari movement, part of the Akhbaris. And you can read about that, in many different books. You could look at Devin Stewart's book on, the formation of Shi'i fiqh. And I highly recommend, again, that you take a look at these books here. And I'm going to talk about this letter here from Abu Hanifa to Uthman al-Batti. What I'm going to talk about here is this book, very famous book here. All right. So, Al-Maturidi and the Development of Sunni Theology in Samarkand by Ulrich Rudolph, translated by my friend Rodrigo Adam, Chicago alumnus, I might add, and published by Brill. So, Brill books are real expensive and all this and that. I've heard that this book is widely available on the internet through a very special Russian website. And so, I'm going to read for you some little bits of this. And what's pertinent here. So this book is about Imam Maturidi. Everyone knows that Maturidism is the school of al-Kalam, or Islamic theology, that's become associated with the Hanafi Madhhab. And so what I'm going to talk about, and what this book talks about a little bit, is what's the precursor to Maturidism. And that would be, obviously, Abu Hanifa's extant writings on theology. And so what he's doing here with this book is he's going to look a little bit at what the theological background was in Transoxania and Khorasan, this region here in the northwestern part of Iran, modern day like Uzbekistan, and how that kind of laid the foundation for Imam Maturidi's school, and how it helps us to understand Abu Hanifa's theological positions. And, you can also find stuff from like Joseph van S., Theologie und Gesellschaft im 2 und 3 Jahrhundert Hijra, eine Geschichte des religiösen Denkens im frühen Islam. So you can find that too if you want to read about this more, if you know German. So as I was discussing before, a lot of people kind of thought that many Hanafis were part of the Murji'a movement. They even accused Abu Hanifa as being Murji'i. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. It's well known that this was thrown against Abu Hanifa, this accusation that he was Murji'i. Abu Hanifa himself rejected this criticism and explained that the description Murji'a was only an invective used by spiteful opponents and ought to be replaced with Ahl al-Adl wal Sunnah. So this sounds, this is an interesting term, Ahl al-Adl wa Sunnah. So as we know, the Ahl al-Hadith were using the term Ahl al-Sunnah, and we know the Mu'tazila were calling themselves Ahl al-Adl. Here Abu Hanifa says Ahl al-Adl wa Sunnah. So maybe he's taking an intermediary position. It's not quite clear. Maybe he means that the Hanafis comprised of both, some of each. It's not entirely clear. And at this time, I don't think these terms were really quite that crystallized as much as they were maybe a century or two after Abu Hanifa. And so the Murji'a kind of have an interesting history, especially in Iran. So modern day Iran, or what was called Persia, or al-Bilad al-Farasiyya, that area was an area that fell to the Arab conquerors, to the Muslim conquerors, in approximately 1 year exactly, more or less. And in other words, this big civilization that was once a superpower of the world collapsed in 1 year. The Arabs just plowed through it from Kufa on to Khorasan. And so you can imagine what kind of serious upheaval and effects that could have on a society. Imagine if another country such as China conquered America completely with ground forces in 1 year. How much that would change American society. And what happened was that many people began to convert to Islam very rapidly. But this was an issue for the Abbasid government, who relied very heavily on the revenue that they gained from the non-Muslim jizya tax. When they became Muslim, they only had to pay zakat, or maybe a kharij tax, or some, other taxes that were not as lucrative to the state as the jizya tax. However, they did have to serve in the military and other types of things. But the state was concerned with revenue at that time. They must have been hurting for money. And so they were giving these new converts a tough time. And that all plays into this Murji'ite creed that we'll find out here. So the Murji'a became very big in Khorasan and Transoxania, Ma Rawa an-Nahr, as it's called in Arabic, beyond the Oxus River. And so they became an established and prominent religious movement in northeastern Iran by the first half of the 2nd or 8th century Gregorian, and became the deciding factor for the adoption of Abu Hanifa's doctrinal views in the entire region over subsequent decades. So Iran had, more than anywhere else in the conquered lands of the Umayyad and Abbasid Empire, Iran had more conversion of the indigenous population to Islam, more than anywhere else. So the numerous converts may have been welcome to the pious, but they presented a nuisance to governmental administration, the first concern of which was the treasury. Each new convert caused a decrease in the total income from tax collection, since he was remitted the jizya that he had paid as a non-Muslim. In light of these circumstances, it is not surprising that the Transoxania witnessed significant disputes concerning jizya. So in Khorasan, they were not well disposed to relinquish this source of income. and they seem to have nevertheless taken jizya from new Muslim converts. These converts, on their part, were aggrieved by this policy and even tried to sue for their rights from the caliph in Damascus. And in Damascus, the Umayyads and Abbasids, they insisted that it was not sufficient, strictly speaking, to profess Islam, but one had to be capable of practicing religious obligations properly and of properly reciting a surah of the Quran, a chapter of the Quran. And these were new converts. They didn't know Arabic. They didn't know anything. So you could see here that the government was being unjust, trying to require, something that is frankly absurd of new converts in order for them not to pay jizya. And the government knew full well that this had to be difficult, especially for the Sogdian and new Turkish converts in Afghanistan and Central Asia, regardless of how earnestly their conversions had been intended. Those affected by these policies were not ready to acquiesce to these demands. They, of course, expected that their conversion to Islam, a declaration of belief in God and His Messenger, would allow them to be considered believers without any further qualifications. On this premise, they could invoke a position that had already been developed in Islamic theology, represented in its classical form by the Murji'ah. The Murji'ah had defined belief as strictly a declaration of faith, which is also you find in the Maturidi school of Islamic theology today. Unlike what the Ahlul Hadith proclaimed and what the Athari movement proclaims today, which is your deeds are directly related to your level of Iman. So they intended thereby to rule out from the concept of religious belief the incorporation of deeds beyond the basic creedal articulation of Islam. Because you had these new converts who were being oppressed, who were being forced to pay jizya even though they're Muslim, but because they haven't learned the basic rights of Islam, they're being taxed. They saw this as unjust, therefore they adopted this theological position to counteract the oppression that they were having in real life. So it's not surprising then that the Murji'ites would come to take on the cause of new converts. Through completely different motives, a contact point thus emerged in which the Murji'ah became the natural allies of the Transoxanians in their fight against jizya and consequently the ruling authorities. The Murji'ah had managed through their activism to establish themselves as the leading religious movement of the region, and they seem to have accomplished this so successfully that they apparently did not have any serious contenders. If a Murji'ite sought instruction, he still had to journey to Iraq, however, and more precisely to Kufa, which traditionally had been the stronghold of the Murji'ah. Abu Hanifa was the city's most prestigious scholar in his time, and did not hesitate to offer his instruction to these advice seekers from the East. And, some say that he was Murji'ite himself. Many that studied in Kufa and returned to their homes brought back Abu Hanifa's teaching as the fruit of their travels, which is how Hanafism spread to Iran and Central Asia, which we still see today, and also to this Asian subcontinent. So Eastern Iran did not remain Murji'ite in a general sense, but rather adopted Abu Hanifa's particular doctrines almost immediately after their formation. The affirmation at the city of Balkh seems to have shaped the beginnings of this development. So if you ever hear somebody with the name al-Balkhi, that's a Transoxanian city there, not too far away from, you might hear like Tirmidh or other cities over there. And so by 759 or 760, a student of Abu Hanifa's had been made Qadi of the city of Balkh, and with the exception of a short interlude following his death, the Hanafites remained at the helm thereafter. Other cities like Bukhara and Samarkand followed after a certain interval of time, but already in the early 9th century, when our reports became more substantiated, these cities show a thoroughly Hanafite visage. So thus did a comparatively homogeneous religious milieu develop in northeastern Iran, which possessed already at an early stage the foundations upon which a fully fledged theological tradition could develop. Here, Abu Hanifa's teachings spread widely, and not only was his legal methodology readily accepted, but so too were the doctrines that he propounded in the discipline of Kalam. And so we have from Abu Hanifa, who died in 767, letters that he wrote to Uthman al-Batti, the main jurist of the Ahl-Ra'i movement in Basra, Iraq. So here, we have texts of theological significance from Abu Hanifa. Some of them, like the Wasiyah or Fiqh al-Akbar, we still have those today. And we have this letter that's addressed to Uthman al-Batti. And we also have Kitab al-Alam wal-Muta'allam and Kitab al-Fiqh al-Absat. So these are texts that exist that have theological ramifications written by Abu Hanifa, or perhaps some people later transmitting the opinions of Abu Hanifa. So it's very important to note that for anybody interested in early Islamic theology or the history of the Hanafi movement, go take a look at these texts. And it's also important to note that Abu Yusuf in Baghdad, this famous student of Abu Hanifa and the chief judge of the Abbasids, transmitted this letter that was written from Abu Hanifa to Uthman al-Batti. So it already took on this theological and social significance there, where it was being transmitted by the students of Abu Hanifa. Abu Yusuf transmitted it to Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Sama'a, and that person followed him as Qadi in Baghdad. So there was already like a tradition of transmission that was going on in Iraq. And many of these Khurasanians and Transoxanians went and studied in Kufa with the Hanafis and also brought this transmission over to Iran and Transoxania. So Abu Hanifa's Risala, ila Uthman al-Batti, was conceived as a defense and is apologetic in its aims. This was precipitated by two accusations which we come to understand were brought against the author, which he felt compelled to fend off. As he tells us himself, it was reported that he had become a Murji'ite, and furthermore, that he spoke of the believer gone astray, mu'min dal. This criticism on part of the hadith transmitters was provoked by the question of faith or belief, iman. They were not willing to exclude actions from its definition, as the Murji'ites had done, but insisted that belief grew through good deeds and decreased through bad ones. What follows is essentially a detailed description of belief, characterized by a persistently defensive stance against the conception of belief that incorporates deeds. So Abu Hanifa rejected that. It looks like a panorama of the Murji'ite opinions and is in principle, with certain repetitions and overlaps, concentrated on four interconnected themes: the definition of belief that excludes deeds, the equality of belief of all believers, the pushing back of judgment about believing sinners, and the particular case of Uthman and Ali. So it's important to note that from this text, we might show that Abu Hanifa was a proto-Sunni. We might show that, not all of the Salaf were in agreement as to how Iman in particular was defined. Did it include actions or not? Did it include ritual worship or not? Was it just merely the profession of the tongue or the intention in the heart? Although Abu Hanifa here articulates the views sometimes associated with the Murji'ah in a more or less classical manner, he refuses ultimately to be labeled as a Murji'ite. His argument for this is not simply that he has unjustly been considered amongst this group. Rather, he opines that he and those similarly oriented have only been given such a name out of malice and have earned another appellation instead, since the term murji'ah had obviously become an invective. In other words, they threw this word murji'ah as a polemical thing. They did not refer to themselves as murji'ites. They considered themselves as Ahl al-Adl wa Ahl al-Sunnah. All right, as we already mentioned. And so, to give a basic synopsis of Kitab al-Risala, there will be an introduction from Abu Hanifa. There will be allegations from people like Uthman al-Batti or whoever else. And Abu Hanifa will refute that he's a murji'ite. He'll talk about the believer who's gone astray, mu'min dal. And then he'll say, I'm not practicing any innovation, bid'ah, but rather we abide by the Quran and Sunnah of the Messenger of God. So there was already, through Abu Hanifa, a concept of Sunnah that was detached from local practice in a sense. It was starting to move in that direction at least. And then Abu Hanifa argues more about the expression mu'min dal. He tries to give a definition of belief. Muhammad called the people at first only to testify to the one God, yashhadu, and affirm iqrar, his prophethood. Whoever followed this call attained the status of believer, as a mu'min or a Muslim. And then he talks about the separation of belief and actions. Duties, fara'id, were only explained to the believers, ahl al-tasdiq, at a later point, and are thus considered as deeds, amal, that enlarge upon the actual act of affirmation, tasdiq. So it's well known that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with the Sahaba, his companions, first, what did he do? He taught them Iman. Did he say they don't have Iman? No. He said they have Iman. And then later, he taught them all the deeds, all the rites of worship. So here, Abu Hanifa is arguing, were those people not Muslim in the early time just because they didn't know all the rituals quite yet? Of course not. They were Muslim. Therefore, even nowadays, when someone converts to Islam, they might not have all the deeds, but they are Muslim through their profession, through their tasdiq. And whoever contravenes them, therefore, has not lost faith itself. So if you're not doing those deeds, that doesn't mean necessarily that you've lost faith. And Abu Hanifa argues that there's no differentiated ranking in belief. People differ in carrying out duties. Belief, in contrast, is equal amongst all the angels, or Ahl al-Sama' and the people. Okay? And he says that in the position of sinners, a person can, without losing his belief, become disobedient, asin, and make mistakes, sinful ones, especially if he is ignorant, jahil, or astray, dal. Even Moses and Jacob in the Quran made these types of mistakes. And he goes on to say, regarding the separation of belief and actions, if duties really belong to belief, then what would the first adherents to Islam be called before they were explained its duties? Disbelievers, reminiscent of the doctrine of the Khawarij, or neither believing or disbelieving, like the Mu'tazili might say? In addition, Ali himself described the adversaries whom he fought as believers. And when it came to Uthman and Ali, one of the two parties, which nevertheless remained believers, must have been wrong, saying which one of them we will leave to God. The promise and threat. A believer without sins is awaited by paradise. A believer who sins is awaited by hell. The decision concerning a believing sinner is left to God. And when it comes to Uthman and Ali, we leave it to God, since both were companions of the Prophet and transmitters of his Sunnah. So this is the proto-Sunni kind of outline coming out here with Abu Hanifa. And Abu Hanifa says, our doctrine corresponds to the views of many well-known authorities, which Abu Hanifa will list by name. The first civil war, the fitan, or fitna, had to do with a fight between the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. They all remained, despite possible mistakes, believers nonetheless. So this is a proto-Sunni theology, you might say. And the name Murji'ite is just an invention of spiteful opponents. In reality, those so described stand for adl, justice. Thus they thought to be called Ahlul Adl wa Ahlul Sunnah. In conclusion, tentative qualifications to this explanation offer to continue the correspondence and blessings. So that's kind of the summary of this letter that Abu Hanifa wrote to Uthman al-Batti. And so there's a lot of important things that can be drawn from that, but it gives you kind of a basic idea as to the intellectual milieu or the conversations that were going on during this time when it came to Islamic theology. Okay, and you can also go and take a look at al-Fiqh al-Akbar. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of al-Aqīdah al-Taḥāwī. I believe al-Fiqh al-Akbar does go a little more in depth, but quite a lot of similarities there, which is very interesting to note. In the basic creed there, you also have the letter there to Uthman al-Batti. So it gets very interesting. And then what I would like to transition to is talking about kalam, and how does that fit in with the Hanafi madhhab, kalam, and how did that kind of evolve with Islamic history, on top of everything that we've just discussed. So this part of the video, I want to talk about the early resistance to Maturidi kalam, to the theology of Imam Maturidi, which later became dominant in the Hanafi school. And it also highlights the strain between these kind of two branches of Hanafism that existed from the very beginning. This kind of more of a Ahl al-Hadith approach by Abu Yusuf, and a more of a rationalistic approach by Muhammad Shaybani. And they coincide with kind of theological views as well. And so, as we discussed, Iran and Transoxania, Marwa and Nahr, they both were pretty dominated by Hanafism, became the dominant legal school in the region. That's pretty well known. And many of these jurists accepted Abu Hanifa's distinction between faith and deeds, and his view of the stability of one's faith without increasing or decreasing. They condemned, however, theological discussions on these issues by going beyond the limits of the treatise of Creed. So I'm going to be looking at this here. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's from Majalla Darasat al-Diniya. So Majalla Darasat al-Diniya, and this particular article is from Abdullah Demir, Different Interpretations of Abu Hanifa, the Hanafi Jurist, and the Hanafi Theologians. And so you had these kind of two strains here that existed in Transoxania. You had Hanafis that were more towards the Ahl al-Hadith type of theology, which he just simply calls jurists here. And the ones who were more into the Ilm al-Kalam, they weren't Mu'tazili, but they were interested in Ilm al-Kalam. And those he calls the theologians, or Mutakallimun. And so it's understood that there is a distinction between the Hanafi jurists' understanding of Abu Hanifa, who had an apparent authority over the public because they had official administrative positions, and that of the Hanafi theologians who used the theological method of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who died in 944 Gregorian. So the Hanafi jurists who relied on legal sources and manaqib works, biographical genres about miraculous deeds of a charismatic leader, had different opinions on various matters such as the religious legitimacy of the Islamic theology, al-Kalam, the responsibility of the people of Fitrah, Ahl al-Fitrah, and the creation of faith, Iman, and the necessity of consent for faith. They differed from the Hanafi Mutakallimun, who grounded their opinion in the epistles, the Risalat, of Abu Hanifa, which we just discussed a moment ago. So the Risala to Uthman al-Batti, the letter to Uthman al-Batti, it seems that the Hanafi mutakallimun, or theologians, focused on that more. And so I'm just trying my best to give kind of a synopsis and an overview of some, interesting things from this article here. The Hanafis of Transoxania had different opinions on Ilm al-Kalam. Hanafi scholars can be divided into two groups: the theologian Hanafis, who were interested in Ilm al-Kalam and adopted a method of Kalam, and the jurist Hanafis, who remained distant to Kalam. In other words, they just liked basic creedal formulations and did not want to get involved in the more abstract theological philosophical thought. This difference becomes apparent as the various transmissions, rawayat, indicated in the Munaqib works on Abu Hanifa that he is not interested in Ilm al-Kalam, and even banned his son Hamad from any debates about the matters of faith. So some people tried to attribute this anti-Kalam attitude backwards towards Abu Hanifa when it actually might not have been there. Whereas the theologian Hanafis, or Hanafi scholars of Samarkand, think that Abu Hanifa did not approve discussions by incompetent people, from which there can be no result deduced, but not the discipline and the method of Kalam. So they had different interpretations of these transmissions. This group consists of the Hanafi scholars who were mentioned as those of us who are truth seekers, and who had adopted the theological method. The importance and necessity of Ilm al-Kalam and its religious legitimacy were advocated by the first period scholars in their works, like al-Maturidi and his Ta'wilat al-Quran, this very multi-volume, tafsir of Quran, Quranic exegesis. And then you also had Abu Yusr Muhammad al-Bazdawi, who died in 1100 Gregorian, and many others. And some of these Hanafi jurists, they mention Abu Hanifa's fatwa about two people discussing whether the Quran was created or not. The createdness of the Quran, khalq al-Quran. While we were sitting with Abu Hanifa, a group brought two people before him and said, one of these two claims that the Quran was created, makhluq, by God, and the other, the Quran was uncreated, غير makhluq. And basically Abu Hanifa said, do not perform salah, prayer, behind either of these people. I said, yes, for the first one, as he does not accept the eternity of the Quran, and asked, but what is wrong with the second one, so that we cannot perform salah behind him? Then he said, both of them had disagreements over deen. Disputing over the religion is an innovation, bid'ah. And so basically, it's saying, the mutakallimun, the theologians, said, well, the reason Abu Hanifa didn't like this discussion is because these people were incompetent in the matter. They were just disagreeing, and they weren't actually having sincere debate about this issue. They were just being hard-headed, and so it was not possible for this discussion to come to fruition or have any benefit. And it was also narrated that Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani also had this same opinion regarding, or the same idea that Abu Hanifa here was not talking about banning Ilm al-Kalam, but just talking about, fruitless debates are not worth our time. And al-Maturidi interprets the verse in the Quran, Prophet, they ask you about the spirit, ruh, say the spirit is part of my Lord's domain, Amr Rabbi. You have only been given a little knowledge from al-Isra. He uses this verse against Abu Yusuf. So Abu Yusuf held that Ilm al-Kalam leads people to disbelief because he was more with the Ahl al-Hadith. And many of the later Ahl al-Hadith oriented Hanafi jurists would kind of side with Abu Yusuf. Al-Maturidi, he disagrees with Abu Yusuf here. Okay? And he states that the verse refers to the discussions that are impossible to give any results and lead to deviance, rather than to Ilm al-Kalam itself. Besides, al-Maturidi argues that it is allowed to talk about matters of faith and to engage with kalam by pointing out the verse, debate them in the most dignified manner, from Surah Al-Nahl. So, Abū Yusuf is also known to say, he who acquires faith in a hostile matter will become a disbeliever. He who earns assets with chemistry goes to bankruptcy. And he who demands gharib al-hadith becomes a liar. So, al-Maturidi and another scholar, al-Saffar al-Bukhari, and other Hanafi mutakallimun prefer to interpret single reports ahad in the sources by taking their soundness and context into consideration. They apply the same method to the various transmissions, rawayat, against kalam conveyed by Abu Hanifa and Abū Yusuf, and they evaluate these revelations regarding the intent of the owner of the word and other stories and evidences. On the other hand, the jurist Hanafis, who read the same narration superficially, adopt an understanding of Abu Hanifa as someone who repented from kalam and who stood distant from kalam, in spite of his theological doctrines. In the years that followed, even though the authority of Imam al-Maturidi gained strength slowly over time, it is hard to assume that Hanafis, who had remained distant to kalam, internalized the theological method and approach of al-Maturidi right away. So basically, what this is saying here is that their different approaches to Islamic law also translated to their different approaches to Islamic theology. So you had some Hanafis who were more rationalistic, and they prioritized actually logically doing some logical reasoning or analysis as to the message contained in narrations or in hadith. On the other side, you had some Hanafis who were less interested in that. They were more literalistic with the meaning of the hadith, more like the Ahl al-Hadith. So you have this tension within the Hanafi madhhab regarding how we interpret a text, or linguistic hermeneutics, in other words. And so, anything that's ilm al-kalam is influenced by the Mu'tazili. They may take a different epistemology, a different stance, make it something their own that is subsumed under a different creed than what the Mu'tazili held, but they are borrowing little tools from the Mu'tazili in order to engage in these ilm al-kalam debates or discussions. And then what happened is you had what was called the Qarakhanids, who came in 1041 and ruled over Transoxania and Khorasan until 1212. They kind of also wanted to give dominance to the Hanafi jurists who preferred the literalistic interpretations of hadith, whose theology was more like the Ahl al-Hadith. And so you have even the famous Hanafi jurist Qadi Khan, who lived in 1196, or he died in 1196 rather. He conveys that al-Maturidi's opinion that the person who can claim that he saw God in his dream is worse than a worshipper of idols. He also mentions the view of the Hanafi scholars of Samarkand on the matter. The claim that one can see God in his dream is invalid, batil. He also states his personal opinion that it is better not to talk about this issue. This shows that he does not prefer to talk about theological matters more than necessary. He also states openly that redundant engagement with kalam is blameworthy. So the famous, Fatawa Qadi Khan, that was Qadi Khan's opinion about it. He was more of a Ahl al-Hadith Hanafi jurist. And so the type of Hanafism that focused on, this Ahl al-Hadith kind of methodology remained distant from kalam because they thought that Abu Hanifa and Abū Yusuf had forbidden kalami discussions. Whereas Abul Yusr Muhammad al-Bazdawi mentions this issue in his work Usul al-Din, endeavoring to explain that the religious legitimacy of kalam, and al-Bazdawi says the scholars have failed to agree on learning, teaching, and writing about kalam. He states that the majority of the scholars in Transoxania do not permit this discipline and forbid it. He also conveys that in the region, people did not favorably consider people engaged with ilm al-kalam. The theologians were disdained, and fiqh was held more important than kalam. And this also shows what I was talking about previously, where here's a region distant from the central heartlands of the Muslim world. In other words, distant from Syria, distant from Iraq, where many of these discussions are happening, especially Iraq, and on the peripheries of the Muslim world, where a lot of people who their main interest was on collecting hadith and being hadith scholars, because they didn't have a local practice or culture to hold on to that was connected directly back to the companions and to the Messenger of God, the Prophet Muhammad, or Rasulullah. And so their way of connecting to the Prophet Muhammad was through hadith texts. So they were very centered on hadith, even though they were Hanafi. They were very, concerned with hadith, and they were very concerned with, preserving these transmissions, and were influenced thereby by the Ahl al-Hadith, despite their fiqh being Hanafi. And even you have the very famous al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi, not to be confused with the Tirmidhi of the hadith collection of the 6 canonical hadiths in Sunni Islam, but al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi, who was a famous mystic, hence the word al-Hakim, he had this very nice hadith collection I encourage you all to take a look at, called Nawadir al-Usul, a multi-volume hadith work, very, very nice. And it shows you, and he was a Hanafi jurist, it shows you, the importance of hadith to these Transoxanian Hanafis. Okay? And he was mystically inclined, and even though he was mystically inclined, he was very serious about hadith. But it became such an issue here in Transoxania that there were fatwas that said the testimony of mutakallimun cannot be accepted. One cannot perform salah behind a mutakallim. Theologians are not considered as scholars. Theological books are not considered as works of ilm, knowledge. The term scholar, alim, only includes jurists, fuqaha, and muhaddithun, not theologians, mutakallimun. So there was a lot of very polemical fatwa that were taking place there. And even in the very famous Hanafi fatwa collection called al-Fatawa al-Hindiyya, there, is some anti-kalam rhetoric. You'll see, if one bequeaths his property to be given to scholars, this can include the scholars of fiqh, of hadith, but not the Ahl al-Hikmah. And Ahl al-Hikmah was a term in Transoxania that referred to not only people of a mystical inclination, but people who were very interested in ilm al-kalam. And al-Hakim at Tirmidhi, he identified himself with the Ahl al-Hikmah, hence his name al-Hakim. And his thought was a precursor, his mystical thought was a precursor to Imam Maturidi's theology. So that you can also, take a look at. And so for a long time, the Hanafis were keeping their distance from ilm al-kalam. And, they were kind of, meanwhile, you had Imam Ash'ari that was gaining strength amongst the Shafi'is and the Malikis, and Ash'arism became the dominant, it's this kalami, way of thinking about theology that became dominant with the Shafi'is and the Malikis in the, Middle East and North Africa. In Transoxania, they are still very focused on kind of this Ahl al-Hadith approach, which really is characterized, by, al-Aqidah Taḥāwīya. That's kind of their thing that they were on there, and they were not focused on kalam like Imam al-Maturidi for a long time. However, there was always this small group of mutakallimun that existed in Transoxania, and eventually, Maturidi kalam did spread across pretty much all Hanafis. And it wasn't until, much later that they were able to, gain power. So Hanafis advocating for kalam and its method, they argued for the, understanding by relating it to Imam al-Maturidi. And so by making him like an eponym, he's considered the pioneer of the Hanafi mutakallimun. The Hanafis against kalam based their views on Abu Qasim al-Saffar. And so, he was kind of the pioneer of the view that Abu Hanifa repented from kalam. And the Hanafi mutakallimun, their interpretations of Abu Hanifa is based on the written sources, the, you could say aqa'id, epistles attributed to Abu Hanifa, where it's noteworthy that these Hanafis had relied on the verbal stories and munaqib. Being aware of this situation, Abu Yusuf Muhammad Bazdawi cites the opinion of Abu Hanifa to argue for the religious legitimacy of kalam, basing his argument on a passage in Al-Alam wal-Muta'allam. We argue against those who say that the companions of the Prophet did not dive into such matters, and we say that the situation of the companions of the Prophet is like the community which had no enemy before them, thus they did not need weapons. On the other hand, we are under attack and we need weapons. Al-Kalam. So the scholars who were called as Hanafi jurists in this study were also called as Ahl al-Dhawahir by Abu Shakur Muhammad bin Abd al-Sayyid bin Shu'aib al-Salami. And you also find the term Ahl al-Dhawahir or Ashab al-Dhawahir. Al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi, he actually called people who were so interested in fiqh and not matters of kalam or mysticism, he called them ulama al-Dhahir, which you can find more information about that on my video on the history of Sufi allegories or Asrar al-Sharia. Hakim at-Tirmidhi is a pioneer in that field, and there you could see more discussion about ulama al-Dhahir and how it relates to, Batin versus Dhahir, ilm al-Kalam versus, fiqh, and these types of things here. And so it wasn't until later, until at least the 11th century Gregorian, that Imam Maturidi's ideas started to gain some ground. And that was because there was a threat of Ash'aris who were moving to the region and trying to gain power in the region, trying to spread the Ash'ari kalam in the region there, Khurasan and Transoxania. And you had a scholar of Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, who kind of led the Maturidi response. And he died in the 12th century. And after his death, the Maturidiyya was accepted as a theological school of the Ahl Sunnah. So it wasn't really accepted until about the 12th century there. So it took a little bit of time, at least 200 years for the Maturidi Kalam to kind of gain some traction there. And so the, Hanafi mutakallimun considered themselves as truth seekers, as we, heard before. They gave an independent role for reason, aql, as a source of knowledge in their field, kalam. Whereas the Hanafi jurists, who also were known as the A'imma Bukhara, or the Imams of Bukhara, reduced the authority of reason only in understanding the revelation or texts. So Imam Maturidi adopts the opinion of Abu Hanifa in many matters and provides proof for his opinion with the Ilm al-Kalam method. According to him, if God had not sent any messengers, the people would still have to know God's existence and his unity through reason alone. This opinion by Abu Hanifa was adopted by the Hanafis, who inclined towards the idea of the Iraqi Mu'tazilis. And so rituals and other religious practices are learnt through revelation, while the religion can be learned through using reason. So inna sabila shara as-sama', فَأَمَّا الدِّينُ فَإِنَّ سَبِيلُهُ الْعَقْلُ. And during this time, there was discussions happening on the createdness of faith. One opinion held that faith is created just as any other actions of men. Another, faith should not be called created because it can lead to the createdness of the Quran. Reaching to the grace of God and guidance, which are the actions of God and come to mind when faith is mentioned, are not created. Yet confession and approval, which are man's actions, are created. And another opinion is one should restrain himself from and not state any opinion on this matter. So this was the debate of the day. And, Mu'tazilim really was an urban phenomena. This whole al-Kalam thing was more of an urban phenomena that took place in Baghdad, took place in Basra, in Kufa, in Iraq. And it didn't really spread to these more peripheral, outer rim territories of the Muslim empire until later. So at first, the Maturidi school encountered quite a bit of resistance. And it wasn't until later that it started gaining traction, mostly kind of being used to push back against the invasion of Ash'arism. And so that's kind of important to note also with the history of Hanafism. A lot of, Hanafi thinkers, a lot of Hanafi thought you'll find come from Transoxania, like, al-Marghinani, who is the author of al-Hidayah, for instance. You'll find many Hanafi usuli authors. Usulis are also very much into this rational stuff, very much into, they might be into Mu'tazili kind of influences or ways of thinking. So all this kind of goes together in Central Asia that creates a very, very nice intellectual milieu or environment or what have you that created a lot of Hanafi scholarship, between the 10th and especially, 12th century, 13th century there. It was kind of a golden age or golden zone for Hanafism in the mid-medieval period. And later on, you can see this crux being taken on by the Ottomans too, which we will get to much later in this series. For now, I'll bid you adieu, adios, goodbye.